Hey, welcome back to Garbro's Field Desk. Have for you Chapter 11 of the Book 1 Mk.II redo. Like, subscribe, comment down below. Let's go. Chapter 11, Fortress of Trees. Domino sniffed at Yule's neck, inhaling sharply and audibly.
You still smell like her boss.
God damn it, get away from me! Yule roared and swung around to try and land a slap on the sniffing rider. Domino danced away with a laugh and dived over one of the many tall bushes that rippled across the forest floor, escaping his judgment once again. Yule had been taking a lot of guff from his troopers for spending a night with Alavara, and they all seemed to revel in the fun that was to poke at him, or to say that he was glowing. Cosmly and company arrived in the thickly wooded area a few days after leaving Immelnoris, and made a small outpost in the deepest part of the trees. They were able to find a small clearing where they could get their vehicles in and out, and have a highly defensible position on the peak of a large hill. The slight elevation allowed them to have an eye on anything coming their direction, except for the rear which faced Immelnoris. Hours were spent marking a driving route for the vehicles so they could travel in and out of the camp, then finding two more of them in case of an emergency. With a bit of digging and chopping, the deed was done with just a little sweat of the brow. The majority of this hilltop outpost was earthworks, with the company digging into rock and soil to form their pillboxes or trenches, then stacking some of the felled lumber here and there for cover. Yethis commented that it looked like a giant klapop nest when she saw it finished, and humans were surprised to hear that there was a beaver analog on this side of the Vale. Down below on the rear of the hill, the dragoons constructed a rough wooden corral to hold their horses, and had rotations where they would shepherd the herd out into the grassy areas so the beasts could graze. The compliant nature of the breed made this an easier deal than it should have been, and the dragoons breathed out a sigh of relief that the valley elves had bred some intelligence into the steeds. Chikily was given the task of sticking out in the treetops and looking out for anything that may be coming or going in the distance, and could usually be seen skipping along the treetops to and fro as he made his rounds. Eris, however, stayed tight to Yule in case he had to send her off in a hurry to ask for help, while normal pump-a-rum runners brought letters and mail to Yule from the city. It took 4 more days before the brush-feathered appeared, and they were not alone either, as they had brought some friends with them. Yule was using a woods exe, a broad-bladed axe made by the valley elves, to hew at a piece of half-tree for a field table when he saw Chikily running across the treetops and yelling Yule's name. Yule almost cricked his neck from how hard he spun it to the yelling, and hefted the axe in his right hand while running down the hill, drawing out his M9 with his left as his boots pounded the ground. Eris stepped after him along with 10 of his riders, and Chikily flapped down from the trees to land in the grass before them with a whump of weight and air pressure. He pointed both his wings into the forest, his face alight with excitement.
Chikily saw them! They finally returned, and there are other riders with them!
Yule narrowed his eyes and looked off into the forest where Chikily was pointing. No, not riders, Chick. Not riders. We don't have anyone down that way. Yule looked down to Eris and pointed the axe towards the hill fort, of which barrels of multiple weapons began to swivel in rough wooden pillboxes and turn towards the forest. Go fetch Britta, please. Eris left the ground with a single strong beat of her wings, and Yule waited near the tree line with his other riders for the harpies to come out of the brush. With the rustle of leaves, they finally appeared, and they looked as if they were walking dead on their heels. Yule took one look at them before turning on his heel and bellowing at the outpost. Gruesome! Yethis! Yule heard Gruesome before he saw him emerge from the fortifications, the corpsman's boots thudding so hard on the ground that it was like the grass suddenly grew a heartbeat. Yethis sprang like a deer after him, but stumbled and almost tumbled down the hill, thankfully catching herself and rolling back into a run. The brush-feathered were covered in blood and gunshot wounds, many of which appeared to be shrapnel fragments or buckshot, and there were only 2 of them, not the 5 that had set out from Immelnoris. The ones that stood before Yule now were the singular female and the smaller of the males, both of whom still wore the ghillie suits he had given the group before they had left. Behind the blood-stained harpies emerged a couple ragged platoons of soldiers, and they looked as rough as the brush-feather did. The entire ragtag group appeared as if they had been peppered with munitions for miles, some of them still hefting their rucksacks, while others just had their weapon and battle rigging. A lot of them wore the black, crimson, and gold of Germany. Others bore the Czech blue, red, and white, and a sprinkle of them wore the white and red of Poland. Yule flattened his hat to his head to make sure the amulet made contact, and spoke aloud to the one in front, who wore a field cap and no helmet. "I appreciate you keeping my harpies safe. I hope you come here as friends." The grizzled man in front of him was a German, having a strong, proud jaw that clenched purely on reflex. His face had enough grooves in it that a blind man could read that he had seen a thing or two, and done even more. "Your German is flawless for a redneck," he growled out, but it bore humor. "I wish I could take the credit," Yule replied, smiling with his eyes but keeping his mouth in a line. The man gestured towards the 2 battered harpies, his voice low. "Neither can we for getting here. These brave little vocal folk won the day, and even then, so few of us made it through." "So few of you?" Yule asked, and leaned to the right to peer over the man's shoulder. "We set out with a full company. This is all that is left," the man said, motioning back towards the battered group of soldiers behind him. "The Vogel folk were able to get us into the base and leave the leaflets from Brita. It appears they have been hiding all around us and gathering information from what we can guess, as we don't speak their twittery language. However, they were there at the meeting point when the day came, and we brought all of our men with us. Things have been fishy ever since we arrived, and nothing has been as agreed to." Gruesome arrived and ripped open his medical bag before he came to a skidding stop. Inside were the usual human implements used for field operations, but also bags of what looked like greasy sludge, bottles of many colored liquids, and a kind of bandage that looked like it was constantly wiggling. Gruesome pulled out his tweezers and began pulling shrapnel from the brush-feathered, his mouth set in a grim but professional frown. "Fragmentation from 40mm grenades," Gruesome murmured, and flicked a large shard of metal at Yule which had come out of the female harpy's leg. Yule caught it, surprised Gruesome had spoken, and held it in his hand, rolling the bloody metal fragment over in his digits. Yethis began to cut open her finger and speak the rituals of healing as she walked towards the harpies, and the brush-feathered closed their eyes, knowing that the worst of it was over. As Gruesome was pulling metal out of the female brush-feathered, she began to tremble as the exhaustion and relief set in. The more metal Gruesome pulled out of her, the more it became apparent these troopers were running for their lives the entire way towards Immelnoris. Slugs from rifles, shrapnel from explosives, wood fragments from trees. It was like they had been hunted the entire way to the outpost. "What the hell happened?" Yule asked, but heard a noise and turned his head. He looked over to see the female harpy was starting to choke and sob, her feathers almost rattling from how hard she shook. Tears streamed down her dirty face and left trails as it cleansed away the filth. Gruesome set down his tools as she began to cry while looking down at her bloodied avian feet, and he cleaned away the blood on his hands. Gruesome, the scarred veteran of many tours in the desert. The last person many of his marine infantrymen saw as they passed in the field, the man whose job it was to patch together the broken, knelt down and wrapped his huge arms around the shuddering harpy, and whispered to her in perfect Tunka, "It's okay. It's all right."
Try it.
She sobbed back in the language, her shoulders heaving as she hiccuped and snot beginning to drip from her nose. I know, it's okay. You made it here." Gruesome murmured as he pulled her in tight, then scooped up the other harpy and pulled him into the hug as well. The male just leaned against Gruesome. He didn't cry or weep, but just went limp against the huge corpsman, exhausted. Yule and the German looked down at the little scene with set jaws, while Yethis quickly shuffled over and added her own arms to the hug as well, while still healing the smaller male with her bloody finger. The German looked over to Yule, then held out his hand. Oberfeldwebel Piper. Yule blinked at the familiar name, but clapped the hand in his own. Yule. Britta came running her way there through the brush and jogged to a halt in front of Piper, giving him a salute in which he returned. She then spoke out in German while reaching out to shake his hand, her eyes filled with happiness.
"Piper, you're alive!"
"Just barely. We all thought you were dead as well. Good to see that it's not the case," Piper replied, taking her hand and giving it a relieved shake.
"They did their best."
Britta said with a grin, then looked behind him.
"This is all that's left?"
Piper nodded and began their tale. Since arriving on the other side of the veil, their markers were taken. They were disarmed while inside the base, and plugged away into a corner of the base footprint along with everyone else who was not a part of this mysterious main clique that ran the base. I am used to elitism among the ranks, but this was odd, even for me, Piper said with a rueful glare, and watched Gruesome pick up both of the harpies and carry them over towards the outpost, while Yethis picked up his medical bag and carried it behind them. Piper went on to tell Yule how men and women of the company started going missing. Every dawn, Piper would hold a formation into account, and they were always down a trooper every morning without fail, at the average rate of a soldier a day. When he would go to command to ask where his trooper was, he would then be told that they were out on a special assignment, but the soldier would never return. Additionally, the Southern Elves were being quickly folded into the ranks of the main guard at the camp until they were the majority in number, and still further the humans were pushed into the corner of the base. There were even times when Command and the Chosen Children would speak of the human soldiers with open disdain, and all requests for veil transfers were always denied. More and more he observed personnel coming through the veil, and they always wore the same face when they would look upon a human or valley elf. Open disgust. I knew things were beyond strange when I caught one of the upper command off guard. I had burst into his quarters after news of the ambush had happened. For a split second, his eyes, they were no longer what I would have known to be human. I had but a moment to see this when his eyes sprang back to the normal brown I had known them to be, and he started watching me closely every day since. Piper ran the pad of his index finger down the bridge of his nose as he took a moment to think. I don't know they were doing it, as I never told any of us when we asked, but they are growing the size of the veil, expanding it, and hewing out the rock. What was once a cave is now a giant cavern, allowing them to bring in more things from the States. We were told that you folks slaughtered the entry team, and that you were terrorists trying to occupy the veil and ransom the world for your own gains. We were given the assignment to come and eradicate you, but all we did was get shoved into the corner of the base, get sent on suicide missions, or just disappear completely. When I finally caught them speaking Elvish in the open, right out of the veil, greeting each other, that's when I knew something was definitely not right. After a while, we found the letters and made our escape. They hounded us through the fields and grass, cutting us down when they could find us. The harpies hid us as best as they could, and we fought back when we were able, but they somehow had the ability to find out where we were without actually seeing us, raining down mortar fire, or a Finnick would suddenly lurch out of the tree line and pin us down with his grenade launcher. Piper lit up a crumpled cigarette and gave a harsh inhale before blowing the smoke out of his nose. He was quiet for a moment, rubbing the thumb of his smoking hand across his forehead before he spoke. We set out with a company of riflemen. This is all that's left. We were hunted down by our own countrymen. Why? What is going on? Britta looked to Yule, and Yule stepped forward, motioning to the troopers who were waiting patiently in the background despite how tired they were. Head on up to the outpost. We have food and water there. Britta, if you want, you can fill them in. You're not under my command. With that, he began his walk back towards the outpost. Britta started to fill in Piper on her and Gremlin's findings, and slowly the two pieced together all the things that seemed to be part of the same puzzle. Yule had already come to the same conclusion on his walk back to the outpost, but one fact still dug a deep burrow in his skull. They were making the Veil Gate bigger. To him, that meant they wanted to bring in the bigger weaponry. He knew what a Finnick was. It was around the same footprint as an M1117, but a bigger gate meant tanks, larger armored combat vehicles, and aerial vehicles. Yule mounted the top of a pillbox and thumped down the other end, landing solidly on the bottoms of his boots. He kinda regretted that, as his heels were now buzzing, but he trudged on into the center of the outpost. In the middle of it was the main command bunker, nestled deep down into the hill where they had hit rock, and they made it as strong as they could with timber and felled trees in case they came under attack by range-supporting ordnance. Inside this main bunker, Gruesome was cleaning off the harpies with a wet rag. Yethis was helping him, currently wiping away at the male brush-feathered's cheeks and cleaning away the grime and powder burns. Chikily, Yule asked to the room, and Chikily plodded over, looking worriedly at the other harpies. Chikily, hey, don't worry about them, they'll be fine.
Were 5 brush-feathered when harpies left?
Chikily said softly, and he looked up at Yule, a worried expression across his face. Yule's eye stared down at the harpy as his mouth formed an angry frown, and Chikily could see the hard regret that began to rim Yule's eyes. Yes, Chikily, I know. I know there was. Now there are 2. I know. Look, bud, I need you to run a message to Coco. Can you do that for me? Chikily puffed out his chest and spoke with as solid a voice as he could muster.
No fear in these feathers. Chikily hears.
Yule nodded and quickly scribbled out a long note, handing it to Chikily. Chikily went to grab it, but found Yule was still holding on to the rolled-up note, and Chikily paused. Chikily, if things get hairy, you punch out and come back. You hear?
You hear?
Chikily asserted with a determined smile, and Yule released the scroll. Chikily ran around, gathering up all his equipment for the flight, while Eris stalked over and began to try and comfort the still crying female harpy. She still clung to Gruesome as he tried to clean all of the dried blood from her war-torn body. Piper and Britta were just mounting the edge of the outpost when Chikily soared over the top of their heads, almost taking off Piper's field cap, and he flapped aggressively up to his cruising altitude. Piper chuckled once, then turned around to watch him fly off into the high sky. When Chikily was but a smear on the big blue, Piper turned to see his troopers had already passed out asleep, scattered among the many bunkers and foxholes where Veil Riders stood over them, taking the guard as they slept. Britta had filled Piper in on what happened to the column, and he knew full well these men had ripped those vehicles apart themselves, but it was already past time to be caring about that. He should have felt anger, but all he felt was exhaustion and soul fatigue. There, to his own reckoning, was a true enemy that had been playing them all against each other, and last he checked, it wasn't these Americans who had tried to hunt them down. Piper thought that, from now on, every human had to be on the same side if they ever wished to make it back home. He figured that Yule must have been thinking the same thing. Only reason why he would so readily bring Britta into his ranks and not even blink at the European troopers. Britta led Piper into the command bunker, both of them arriving in time to see Yule addressing his NCOs. And they're trying to make it bigger. I've sent word to Zerk Company that we have to start moving in on this thing. If they bring in even one Apache, we're all fucked, and they're going to hunt us down like they did the Europeans. Keep watch over them. Make sure they are fed, and help them get back into fighting form. Dismissed. The NCOs of Cosmo & Company turned and filed past Piper, many of them clapping the German NCO on the shoulder before exiting out the mouth of the bunker. Yule turned with a clink of tin mugs and held 2 brimming cups of his precious retort coffee. He held one out to Piper, who took the cup in both hands, leaning in to savor the smell. Pretty fucked up, I know. Played us like a fiddle. The more I think about it, the angrier I get, Yule said chidingly, taking a sip of his own tin cup. They knew how we would react when we saw blue hats pop out of the veil. Then they twisted the narrative all the way around its head to their own needs. To think, all those tinfoil hats were speaking the truth, except they got it wrong, of course. Piper raised his brows to Yule, taking off his cap and sipping heavily from the cup. They pinned it on lizards. If only they knew it was fairies the entire time. Yule said with an angry smile, sipping from his cup. Piper gave a wet chuckle as he tried to swallow his coffee without choking on it, and they both shared a wry spout of laughter. Britta stood nearby, watching them both closely. Piper coughed once, then spoke up. After what Britta has told me, I think that maybe her convoy was sent as some kind of lure to try and draw you out. Give them ammunition to use in order to bring in heavier vehicles. Highly possible, Yule agreed. I would have done the same if I had come across the convoy. Germans already have the tendency programmed, after all. Piper said with a grin, and Yule laughed quietly, getting the reference of the ambushes the Germans had perfected in the Second World War. The 2 men looked over to Gruesome, who was now just holding the female brush-feathered as she choked out in sobs, and the 2 cleared their throats awkwardly. Perhaps this was not the time for gentle banter. Anyway, Oberfieldwebel, you are welcome among my men. I'm afraid that if we wish to continue killing each other, it will have to wait until we have dealt with the Veil, Yule said. I am sure we can set up a date later on for that if we wish, Piper added, and he heard Britta snort in the background. Old habits among soldiers die hard, it seemed, as there was no better time for humor than when in the company of the miserable. How many more regular human troopers are left at the base? Yule asked, putting a hand in his pocket as he supped. Not many. Maybe a few platoons. I don't even know if they are all even human, after all. I know all my lads are, at least. Yule mused, pulling over a crate or two for them to sit on. How many total combat elements? Quite a few, actually. The children of the Chosen, or whatever they are, have been getting drilled hard in the base and are more or less the bulk of the combat arms there. So, we have all been played by Elven Fae, have we? Yule shrugged his lips along with a shoulder. Seems that way. Piper grunted and sat down heavily on one of the crates Yule had pulled over. What a bunch of bullshit. So their plan is to use our tech to invade this place, eh? Yule nodded, and Piper just guffawed. Heavens above, that is playing the long game at its finest. Yule filled in Piper on their current strength, the resources they had, as well as what his co-commander Coco had been up to in the east. He also told the German of what the dwarves were cooking up in the north, and the support they had from some of the races. When Piper had all the holes filled in, Yule gave him his own personal bunk space to sleep, and headed out of the command bunker to get some fresh air. Fresh air and to get away from the female brush-feathered, who had not stopped crying the entire time, and it was starting to weigh on Yule's conscience like stones would on a feather pillow. The European troopers were still sleeping, and the Veil Riders were slowly trading out the watch to keep guard over them, detaching off to go eat, sleep themselves, or take care of the horses down below in the corrals. Yule found a rough wooden seat and plunked himself down on it. After a moment of staring down into the dirt, he slowly brought his head down and rested it in his hands, running his fingers through his hair. His mind was on the dead brush-feathered, whose bodies were littering the path here with the rest of the slaughtered European soldiers. It was a gamble to do what he did. He knew that much when he had sent them off. But the gamble ended up being a net loss in his mind, with more than 70 people dead and rotting in the open without a proper burial. He felt something hush down near him, and he looked up to see Eris looking down at him, her wings brought together in front of her. Yule breathed in deep and leaned back, inwardly appreciating the kind of stealth she could put on while flying and landing. "Yeah, kid, what's up?" Eris didn't speak for a few moments, then just leaned onto Yule's shoulder and hugged him with both wings. She buried her face into his neck and let out a sigh.
Is okay, Yule.
Yule sat still for some seconds after she had spoken, but leaned his head over slightly to bump his skull against hers. "It's not, Eris, but I know what you mean." She sighed and just held Yule. Her eyes looked up and saw that Yule had flicked something from his face, and saw a bit of water sparkle in the sunlight near the edge of his eye. Inside the command bunker, Yethis stretched and cracked her spine. She had given a lot of blood for the healing of the harpies alone, and thanked the heavens that the other humans were as easy to take care of. She looked down and smiled sadly at Gruesome, who was still holding the wounded harpy in his arms. She was finally asleep, clinging still to the grizzled corpsman, and Gruesome looked up at Yethis. "Can you grab me a blanket, please?" He whispered in Tunka, and Yethis bowed slightly before running off to fetch him a blanket and a pillow as well. Yethis then left out into the approaching dusk and began to heal the sleeping European survivors who lay scattered around the outpost. A splotch of healing here, a yank of metal there, until finally she herself was spent and needed to recoup with some rest of her own. Gruesome stayed with the harpy the entire night, guarding her as she slept. He knew the nightmares would come, and he would be there to ease their onslaught. The next morning came with little fanfare, but with a lot more curious accents. While the company and their guest platoons under Piper breakfasted together, Yule took stock of the current personnel numbers under his umbrella of power. He had taken all of his Vale Riders with him, numbering 66 in strength, along with 4 additional troopers if he included Britta, which he couldn't have left behind and had dragged her along just to reduce headache. Piper, after he and his platoon had rested, held a morning formation to do a count, and also say prayers for their fallen brothers and sisters in the field. To Piper's delight, he had found that he had miscounted through all the chaos of getting here, and was happy to tell Yule that he in fact had 39 soldiers alive and well, making them a larger sized element than he had previously thought, and he combined the 2 smaller platoons into a larger one. Piper was also happy to see his explosives expert had survived the trip in, and quickly rounded her up to introduce her to Yule. Tatiana Moscal was almost as slight as Gremlin was, except instead of black hair, she sported a ruddy red mane that was long on the top and shaved under on the sides. In her hair was also all a manner of wire tucked away in case she needed it, and she constantly smelled of explosives and ozone. When Yule shook her hand and looked into her sparkling green eyes, all he saw was the madness of someone who was touched by the raw power of the shockwave spirit, and knew full well this woman was dangerous beyond all comparison. Despite the air of danger around her, she still held the pleasant diamond-shaped face that he knew a lot of Polish women sported, and her full lips were always held in a pleasant, if unnerving, smile. "Nice to meet you, Corporal Moscal," Yule said, shaking her hand firmly. Corporal Moscal gripped his hand back, but leaned in towards Yule after a few shakes.
Do you mind if I go see what kind of ordnance you're trucking around?
Moscal said with another alarming grin, and Yule flicked his eyes to his left where the makeshift ammo depot was. Sure. Just don't use any of it." Moscal rubbed her hands together with a gleeful giggle and trotted over to the area Yule pointed her to. Yule smelled his hand as he watched her leave and found it to smell curiously of smoke. He then looked up to Piper, who was watching him. "You know she's fucking crazy, right?" Piper just laughed. "Oh, yes, a few bats short of a belfry." After meeting Moscal, Piper then introduced Yule to his other soldiers, the majority of whom were country Germans looking for a bit of adventure. Then came the Czechs, who came purely for answers as to why their unit was disbanded after a mission in the desert during Enduring Freedom. The Polish all seemed to share the same outlook on why they came. They would be damned if they got left behind on this trip, and were keen to show the Germans how real soldiers operated. Yule couldn't help but chuckle at this and the heckling that followed soon after, as the Germans and Polish shared rude gestures and good-natured teasing. Summed up, there were 19 German Heer troopers, 1 Luftwaffe security trooper who had apparently snuck his way into the Heer group, 10 soldiers of the Polish Wojska Ledowa, and 9 Czech paratroopers from the disbanded 601st, whom had long wondered just why they had been disbanded in the first place. This being after finding some relics while operating in Afghanistan in 2008. While the Vale Riders egged on the Polish and Germans, Yule worked his way through the boisterous crowd to where the Czechs were huddled around a small fire making tea, and saddled up to a log nearby to sit on. The Czech 601st troopers nodded towards Yule, and he checked to make sure his amulet had plenty of blood in it before cramming it back into his patrol cap and back onto his head. "So, how many of you came through?" A man bearing the double stars of a sergeant first class spoke up in a good, neutral English while looking down into the pot of tea, stirring it gently with a giant field spoon. "Only 15. All we could manage to slip in. And 9 remain," Yule murmured. "I'll cut to the chase. What did you find in Afghanistan?" The spoon scraped to a stop in the pot, and the man's eyes slowly rose up to meet Yule's. All of the other 601st operators looked to each other, heads unmoving before coming back to Yule. "We found a body." The sergeant first class murmured and slowly spun the spoon in the pot, as well as the tale of their mission. It was March in Afghanistan, and the moon was shining bright overhead, letting plenty of light filter in through their helmet-mounted night vision to illuminate the cave system in front of them. They were out there on that godforsaken mountain under the belief that the head of the insurgency in the area was hiding within, using the herd paths around the mountain and the valley to launch mortar and rocket strikes into Fob Shank. To help alleviate this madness, the 601st sent out a small strike team to cut the head from the snake. There was no resistance the entire way up, not that they expected any, as the drone hovering overhead didn't report anything in their way. With the flick of a toggle, their pecs shot out their lasers and lit the cave mouth up with light, and they moved into the inky black, snuffed out one by one from the gaze of the moon. Gravel and sand had crunched under their feet like snow as they silently wound their way down the tunnel. Their first contact was a man asleep where he sat, his RPK resting across his lap as his head lolled on the back of his ramshackle steel chair. One of the 601st slid out his knife, the metal hissing on the nylon scabbard, before bringing it down with both hands into the eye socket of the man and punching through the skull into the brain. The ruffle of fabric, a squelch of flesh, and the crunch of his spine breaking on the back of the metal chair were the only sounds to entertain the walls of the cave. The knife-bearing operator ripped the knife out, and then buried it into the neck and armpit of the dead sentry for good measure, wiping the blade clean on the dead man's shirt and slipping it back into the scabbard. The sergeant first class looked down at the lantern that burned down to the wick and smiled. If the insurgent had been a little more disciplined, there would have been light in here, and he may have been able to see their faces before he died. A pity. The 601st Strike Team moved further into the cave system and found two more resting insurgents, this time actually sleeping in bedrolls instead of on guard, and dispatched them quickly by two of the strike team stomping down with their heels onto the throats of the sleeping men. Despite shattering their throats, they held their heels there until the gurgling stopped, while the rest of the strike team watched down the cave tunnel for any movement. Once the sleeping men were laid to eternal rest, the strike team moved further into the cave, finally finding the main chamber. They had been making sure to snuff out any candle or lantern they came across, keeping the darkness for themselves and not letting their enemies have the comfort of the light. Peeking out from the dim, they observed the main chamber and saw their target, the leader of this little schoolyard insurgency. Around him were about 6 fighters still armed, some of them listening in on radios, watching movies off of VCRs, or reading through Vogue magazines. The strike team of the 601st pushed in like a tidal wave of lead, weapons flashing and barking like hounds of lightning released to the hunt. Insurgents fell to the cave floor or died where they sat, some of them covered in the tattered, ripped remains of swimsuit models looking just as surprised as they were. Except for one insurgent, who hadn't moved at all. For some reason, none of the bullets had struck the insurgent leader, somehow being just enough off course to avoid striking their target, which of course made no sense to the strike team leader, as his men were crack shots, and they were only 20 yards away. While he dropped his magazine and grabbed another from his chest rig, he saw a flash of light and heard a scream. A fireball had whipped across the room and engulfed one of his troopers, who screamed and danced in the writhing flame. Shouts and curses echoed in the cavern as some of the strike team tried to put him out, but it was like the flame could not be snuffed. Another fireball roared across the cavern and slammed into the trooper trying to extinguish his brother-in-arms with a nearby blanket. And now he too wailed in anguish as the fire licked and ate at his flesh, burning it to blackened char. The sergeant first class couldn't see what the hell was shooting the fire and could barely see their main target through the haze, but he had had enough of this shit. Pulling out his knife and a tomahawk gifted by an American ranger, he began to sprint towards the figure who seemed to be twirling in the heat haze and laughing. He had to duck as another fireball swirled through the air, singeing his back and sucking at the air in his lungs as it soared overhead and impacted another of his team. As he sprinted forward, he spared a fleeting glance over his shoulder as time seemed to crawl. He saw them, clawing at their faces as flames moved along their skin, rolling on the ground to try and get the fire off of them, screaming as they desperately tried to pull off their gear and crackling clothes. The fire seemed to be alive, wrestling them and coiling around their bodies like a great worm of flame as they shrieked. He had no idea what kind of chemical could burn like that, but the secret would die here and now. Raw heat radiated off of his mission target, burning him like he was ducking his head into a blazing bonfire, but he still lurched forward, leaping with both of his feet to launch himself through the air. As he penetrated the haze, he saw the figure for the first time, what was truly burning his men alive. It had black eyes and skin like charcoal. I had never seen anything like it in all my days. It cackled at me, even as I buried that tomahawk right into its skull. It took a good few whacks, but it died, in the flames along with it. The sergeant first class murmured, pausing for a moment to pour some tea into his field cup and setting the small pot back onto the fire. It had elf ears, much like that one over there. He pointed towards Yethis, who was happily braiding a German man's long golden beard. But it looked so alien, so evil. We killed it, though, and brought the body back, along with the bodies of my men. The elf thing was quickly snatched up by some suits who were waiting for us after I reported what we were returning with. Even diverted the bird from Shank to McLean, which made no sense to me. They snatched up the body, ordered us not to speak of it, and that was that. Soon after, we were disbanded the following year with no reason behind it. But I have an inkling. Yule stared at him for a long time, watching the memories play back in the man's eyes as he sipped his tea, along with the others who all seemed to bear the same loss and pain, not only of their fellow troopers, but an entire unit in brotherhood. Yule broke the silence, holding out his hand. I'm Yule. The sergeant first class eyed Yule's hand for a breath before reaching out and taking it in his. Prusik. Yule nodded comfortingly before reaching his hand out to another check. Good to meet you guys. Now, what's your name? Later that night, Yule sat back in his little office area inside the command bunker inside, resting his head back onto his rucksack. After dinner, the Veil Riders decided to officially indoctrinate the Europeans into the company, giving them the few precious extra passes they had in storage from their first trip in. Having made them official, Piper took Britta back into his command and Yule made the checks autonomous, showing respect to their training and veterancy. What this meant for Gosling Company was that now their total strength was a 109 or 110, depending on what native was doing what, and how many harpies they had with them. This finally allowed for proper platoon grouping, and he had spent most of dinner appointing platoon sergeants and other such bookkeeping so things ran smoothly. The brush-feathered had recovered as well, and the female was sticking to gruesome like glue, learning and inhaling all the knowledge that the corpsmen would give her. The little harpy had even learned how to wrap a bandage with her wings and how to use her claws to operate some of the finer details of a tourniquet in the field. The male was still willing to act as a scout and wanted to be with the 601st Troopers as their personal assistant. Yule was fine with that and paid them both their gold so the contract would at least be fulfilled, despite it being a hollow assurance to the loss of their fellow Harpies. Britta being folded back in with her fellow Germans alleviated the babysitting of her, and it appeared that many of the Europeans didn't harbor too many hard feelings about the ambush. This was the trickiest evolution of combat any of Cosbling Company knew, and there was far more hate for the Fae than there was for each other at the current moment. Yule knew this couldn't last forever, and eventually that chicken would come home to roost. But, for now, there was a common enemy that they could work against and keep things in line. Yule was tired, deep in his soul, and looked to his side where Alavara once lay. He had to admit he was getting the feelings about the whole ordeal and ached to have her next to him again as he slept, and the letters he would send to her would usually just aggravate the pain even more when a response came. He quietly pondered what his long-past wife would have said about this. Probably something akin to "she can do better," which made him sadly chuckle. He stared into the dim light for a bit longer as his mind churned, before reaching over and twisting the lantern so the light died into pitch black. 3 more days passed as Fawcett was sending almost daily letters to Yule, keeping him abreast of the production line that was being set up in the engineer hold. Additionally, the humans of Cosbling Company were mingling happily, which eased some stress off of Yule. On the 4th day, a flight from Savarus came into the outpost, flying in from Immelnorris to bring ammunition and supplies. While the rest of the company were able to get fresh bottles of wine and ammo, Yule couldn't help but break out into a nervous sweat. Savarus was in this flight, and she was holding a long package in her feet. He also saw she had a pistol strapped to a drop holster on one of her legs, and it seemed Coco had completed the contract for him, despite hoping the birdwoman would simply forget. Chikily was in there as well, and landed down in the middle of the Veil Riders with multiple bags tied to him. With a roar of glee, he pulled out 2 of the bottles in which grain alcohol glittered. The roar was met in volume by the Veil Riders, who showered Chikily with praise while unpacking the bottles from him. The harpy looked ragged from flying with the weight, but was in good spirits. The rest of the Himalayan harpies landed down, shaking themselves or stretching their long wings as other Veil Riders grabbed the small crates of ammunition from them and took the ammo to the depot. Then, with a swoosh of wings and air pressure, Savarus landed before Yule, her Merlot red eyes staring into his as a grin played across her fangs.
Long time no see.
She purred, and grabbed the long package from her feet up with her wing digits, resting it against her breast and shoulder. "Savarus, how good to see you again," Yule replied, trying to look anywhere but the harpy.
Liar.
She said flatly, but was still smiling all the same.
Thought Savarus would not be back,
"One could hope," Yule murmured, and Savarus spread the smile to her dangerous eyes.
Savarus has package for you.
The harpy said, and stroked the long thing in her wings while tilting her head to Yule.
But it come with price.
"Here we fucking go," thought Yule, and he sighed, resting his hands on his hips. "What, Savarus?"
Savarus here from Little Birdie. You finally took someone to your bed.
Savarus said in an accusatory tone, yet at the same time it was pondering and flirtatious. Yule glared at her, then both of them trailed their eyes to Chikily. Chikily was currently laughing and holding an open bottle of the grain alcohol he had brought back, and then saw the two staring at him. His laugh quickly died in his throat, and he choked a bit, seeing Yule glaring at him from under the bill of his hat while Savarus winked. Chikily raised a foot and quickly goose-stepped around the back end of the packed Veil Riders, getting himself out of view. "All right, so I did. What does that have to do with you?" Yule growled, taking his hands from his hips and crossing them on his chest. Savarus acted as if she was playing with the wrapping of the package, which Yule assumed was his rifle coming back from Focket, and played her face into a look of idle amusement.
Savaris have little birdies everywhere. Savaris knows the she-elf is not attached to you yet, nor you to her. Savaris also know that elf gave you okay for field interactions.
The harpy said, simpering at Yule.
Savaris just want chance to meet the great and mighty Yule in the duel between the blankets.
Hot chance in hell, feather duster, Yule barked, and looked down at the slowly flustering Himalaya harpy queen. Savarus was now angry, and the wings on her feathers were slowly starting to rise, her hair poofing slightly.
That's fine. Savaris just keep this package as payment for her long trip.
She hissed, and her eyes flashed dangerously. That's fine. I got plenty of rivals. Don't want mine smelling like bird feet anyway. Yule said flatly and didn't uncross his arms. His own anger was starting to slowly eat away at his ingrained bird of prey fear. His back, however, was becoming slick with sweat, regardless of the anger.
Chikily said rifle was special to you. He heard short-legged prince say so.
Savarus growled out and was now starting to really fluff up in rage, seeing her plan fall apart in front of her eyes. Dime a dozen, Yule said, and spat at his feet. This was a lie, of course, but she didn't know that. Around the camp, everyone was staring, and the Himalayan harpies were just trying to look anywhere but at their queen as they tried to hide their snorts of laughter. The pitched yelling began to grow between the two as Piper turned to Domino, who was watching the fight gleefully. Why are they fighting? Piper mused, as he heard Chikily swallow a gulp of alcohol while hiding among the taller troopers.
Bird Lady wants Yule in order to cement her power or something. Yule is afraid of danger birds.
Domino replied, his voice thick with humor as the two combatants' voices raised to a fever pitch. Piper just raised his eyebrows at this information and blinked a few times before looking back over at the argument.
Here, take gross Yule rifle, probably full of beard hair and stupidity.
Savarus screeched as she tossed the rifle on the ground, her hair and feathers as puffed up as her temper. She was almost dark red in the face and sweating from how pissed off she was.
Anyone would kill to bet a harpy queen. I wouldn't want Yule children's anyway. Would probably fly upside down and eat rocks.
Aye, sure, but they would get that from their mother. Yule bit back and stooped down to pick up the rifle still nestled in its travel wrappings. Savarus was so angry that tears were welling up in her eyes. She knew she was beautiful, as many had told her so, and stories were written about her in some chronicles from her prowess in combat. She was so frustrated at the human that she was almost ready to cry from how rude and hard-headed he was being. It was a rare occurrence that she didn't get her way, and this meathead had done it to her twice. There was a break in the combat as Yule dusted off his package, watching her with rage in his eyes. Seconds passed as the two stared at each other, Savarus grinding her teeth.
So Savaris needs a few days to rest, for trip back.
She stammered, fighting back the indignant tears. Fine, stay out of the command bunker. Yule ordered grimly and spun on his heel to take the rifle back inside, ducking down into the headquarters building. Savarus watched him go, shaking with fury, then let out a scream of annoyance that only a royal could possess, and stomped away from the command bunker. Everyone watched her angrily wipe at her face with her wings, and a few of her harpies ran after her. Domino let out a whistle, bringing a cup of grain alcohol halfway towards his face as he spoke.
Ah, man, he really does not like her.
Some of the Himalayan harpies that were around them shrugged and took off their flying rigging. Gruesome had to be called over to translate for them, but he confirmed that Savarus wanted to try and use Yule to pull in more power to take over other harpy clans. A pretty female Himalaya harpy sat down on a log seat and stretched out her wings. Her spine crackled noisily as she arched her back, whimpering with pleasure in her throat before she spoke to those around her.
Savaris think seducing Jewel also let her use his men at arms for conquest. Eri don't see why. She already control biggest happy clan as it is. Eri thinks Savaris just jealous of Chikily.
Piper, after hearing Gruesome translate the words from the little darling of a harpy, gave a wry humph before looking after where the harpy queen had stomped off to. Rather shrewd of her to think it would be that easy. I've only known the man for a few days, and even I can see the challenge of the task she has set to herself. Gruesome turned to the Himalaya harpy, Eerie, and translated, in which Eerie just gave tinkling laughter while kicking her feet happily. Sitting on Gruesome's shoulders was the brush-feathered harpy female, who was resting her head on Gruesome's and looking bored with the whole thing.
So Lily think whole thing stupid.
Again, Gruesome translated, and everyone laughed at what she said. It was all a bit silly to the humans, but it was just the way things seem to be done here in this world. Through the rest of the day, everyone mingled with the Himalayas and shared their meals with them, as well as relishing in the supplies they brought with them. They later learned in the evenings that the Harpies were just a forward supply chain of a longer train of wagons coming in down the road, and indeed the next morning several long covered wagons arrived bearing additional building supplies, more munition, some of the dwarven mortar tubes that were fresh from the engineer hold, a few dwarven engineers, and fresh foodstuffs for the outpost to live off of. There were also a lot of volunteers that came up to help cook and take care of the place, and eventually Yule was worn down by them to let them stay. Unfortunately for Yule, Savaris also wormed her way into staying on the base, declaring that Yule had hurt her feelings and that she was owed recompense by being able to stay and do proper scouting for Cosmoline Company. The first several times she tried, he said no. But by the 5th hour of her constantly screeching at Yule, he finally yelled back at her that he'd allow it, but that she herself was banned from ever entering the command bunker during her stay. Feeling she had finally won one over Yule, she didn't stop acting smug for the entire week that the outpost was expanded. Mortar tubes were dug in deep, and the engineers showed the Veil Riders how to operate the bloop tubes. The volunteers of Valley Elves, Brimtush Oni, and Dwarves helped carve out a more livable space on the outpost, including building actual bunkhouses and dining quarters from the lumber surrounding the place. The Dwarves had outdone themselves with the mortar tubes. The entire length of the barrels were done up with runes, and the openings of the mortars were carved into the shapes of belching extinct trolls or roaring dwarven gods. Even the sights were extremely squared away, perfect mimicries of the actual mortar sights used on Earth, except these were enchanted and automatically adjusted for the wind. They would even self-adjust by the gunner shouting Anurbala at them, though that led to a small language barrier. The Veil Riders who would be manning them had to take crash courses on rough dwarvish directions and numbers, phrases such as down 2 or left 20. With the outpost now looking like a proper forward operating base, or FOB, Yule began drafting his plans for operations and sorties to harass and tarry any enemies that were nearby, and sent out some of the Himalayans to scout from above. He warned them not to get too close and to stay as high and hidden as possible. With their feathers and markings being mostly white, he didn't want them anywhere near the ground or the dark green forest. He also sent word back for any volunteers who wanted to fight. With the dwarves here ready for war and the chosen children drilling themselves into an army, he was going to need all the help he could get. It was time for Yule to break his taboo and give an elf a rifle. And that's the end of Chapter 11 of the Book 1 Mark II redo. If you like these stories and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbro's Field Desk. Spread the word around, share the stories. More or less, I live on word of mouth around here. Join us on X, join us on Reddit now, join us on Discord, join us on Royal Road, join us on Coffee. Coffee is where we get the memberships and kind of help support the channel. Plus, if you're a member, I say your fucking name at the end of the videos, which is where we're going right now. Hurrah! For our first shirts, these guys give $50 per month and hold the channel upon their mighty, thick, meaty shoulders. That's the other Killjoy, Calistred, Aaron Wilbur, where Waffengeist? Waffengeist is coming, okay? When I'm done trying to redo book 1 and finishing up book 4, okay, I'm going to start doing the Waffengeist short stories. Where Waffengeist? Allspark 113, the Mad Lad, Based Boy himself, E Machino, Cody Jero, Death Dancer, and Insane Medic. Then there's our E4 Mafia, my fellow Sham Shields. That's Nox, Vok, Tab, James Buckner, Sonic Arrow, Darkside, Kiwi Bastard, Lacune, Yate Lacune, Josh Beatty, Matty Boy, and Crusader 0625. And of course, we can't forget our Snuffy Squad. Snuffy Squad. They get $5 per month. That's Lone Burrow, Martel, Martlesby, Noodle, Alan Solano 9, Split Iris Bear, Mika, Damon Bain Plays, Scott Anderson, Veritas, Damon McEwen, Supersting 64, Eldorok, Croman, Dalek, Jules, Blonde Lord, Thrace Vega, Devin Schoenholt, Andrew Ingill, Get a Potato, Skelters, Kite Zero, Klutz Cthulhu, Diesel Dog, Cuff Commander, Anto, Inquisitor Matt, Duncan D, and I, DeLorne Smith. And until we see you next time on this side of the veil, that was Eliza, that was Hailey, that was Meowsy, that was Technoward, that was our proofreader, Franners, and this is Garbro's Field Desk. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.